Ever wondered why Native Americans chose teepees over regular houses? Most people think it was just because they were easier to build, but the real reasons are way more interesting. And they'll probably surprise you. You know how some people today can barely handle moving apartments once a year? Well, Native American tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Blackfoot would have laughed at our modern moving struggles. They were practically professional movers, except they didn't have to deal with sketchy moving companies or bubble wrap their china sets. Here's the thing about Buffalo. They were basically prehistoric food delivery services that never stayed in one place. These massive herds would roam across the Great Plains, and the Native Americans had two choices: follow the food or starve. Now let's talk about the logistics of building a permanent house versus a teepee. Building a log cabin back then was like trying to build an IKEA furniture set, except 100 times worse, and without those helpful instruction manuals. It would take months of backbreaking work, cutting down trees, hauling logs, and precisely fitting them together. And after all that effort, you'd have a lovely house that you'd have to abandon when the buffalo decided to peace out. A teepee, on the other hand, that was like the original pop-up tent, except way cooler. In less than an hour, a well-practiced family could break down their entire home, roll it up, and be ready to move. And here's a wild fact. Experienced Native American families could pack up their entire teepee and belongings onto just 2 horses. Try fitting your house on 2 horses. I dare you. The real genius was in the design itself. Native Americans created what we now call a modular home system, except they did it centuries before that became a fancy architectural term. Each part of the teepee had a specific purpose and could be easily replaced if damaged. The poles, standardized lengths. The buffalo hide covering, precisely cut and sewn to fit perfectly. It was like ancient engineering at its finest. Imagine trying to move an entire wooden house across the plains. You'd need an army of people, countless horses, and probably some sort of miracle. The Native Americans looked at that problem and said, "Nah, we're going to be smarter about this." And let's talk numbers for a second, because this is where it gets really interesting. A typical Native American family could break down their teepee, pack all their belongings, and be on the move in about 45 minutes. The same family could set up their home in a new location in roughly the same amount of time. That means they could completely relocate their entire household in less time than it takes most of us to watch an episode of our favorite TV show. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about this nomadic lifestyle was how it shaped their entire worldview. These weren't people who accidentally stumbled upon a mobile lifestyle. They embraced it fully and built their entire culture around it. Their homes weren't just shelters, they were a reflection of their understanding that life is constantly moving and changing. Speaking of building materials, you might be wondering why they didn't just chop down some trees and build log cabins anyway. Well, there's a funny thing about the Great Plains. Trees weren't exactly growing on trees out there. Trees on the Great Plains were about as rare as a smartphone in the 1800s, practically non-existent. While some folks today complain about not having enough closet space, Native Americans on the plains had a much bigger problem, trying to find enough wood to build a decent house. The Iroquois and Cherokee had it easy. They lived in dense forests where trees were as common as coffee shops are in modern cities. They could build their wooden longhouses and cabins without breaking a sweat. Well, actually, they probably broke quite a few sweats, but you get the point. These forest-dwelling tribes could walk outside their front door and find all the building materials they needed. But life on the plains, that was a different story entirely. The landscape stretched out like an endless sea of grass, with trees playing hard to get. You'd have better luck finding a needle in a haystack than finding enough trees to build a proper log cabin. A study of the historical Great Plains showed that in some areas, you'd have to travel over 50 miles just to find a decent stand of trees. That's like having to drive to another city just to get building materials. Except they didn't have cars, remember? Buffalo, though, these magnificent beasts roamed the plains in herds so massive they could stretch for miles. Historical records suggest that before the 1800s, there were somewhere between 30 to 60 million buffalo wandering around North America. That's more buffalo than there are people in most countries today. And each of these walking hardware stores came equipped with exactly what the Plains tribes needed: a thick, durable hide perfect for making tippie covers. Here's a fun fact that'll make your local Home Depot look a bit less impressive. It took about 12 to 20 buffalo hides to make one good-sized teepee. That might sound like a lot, but when you're surrounded by millions of buffalo, It's basically like having an endless supply of free building materials delivered right to your doorstep. The process of turning buffalo hides into teepee covers was actually pretty ingenious. The women, who were the master architects and builders in many plains tribes, would carefully scrape and prepare each hide, then sew them together with sinew. That's animal tendon, nature's thread. They were so skilled at this that the finished product was nearly waterproof. Try getting that kind of quality from today's mass-produced tents. And let's talk about maintenance for a second. A wooden house on the plains would have been like trying to keep a sandcastle intact during a hurricane. The harsh winds, extreme temperatures, and lack of readily available repair materials would have made upkeep a nightmare. But a teepee made from buffalo hide? That was like having a self-healing house. If a section got damaged, you could just replace that part with a new hide. No need to tear down the whole structure or make an emergency run to the nearest forest, which, remember, might be 50 miles away. The Plains tribes weren't just making do with what they had. They were working smarter, not harder. While other cultures were struggling with the heavy lifting of log cabins and the constant maintenance of wooden structures, these folks had figured out how to turn the most abundant resource in their environment into comfortable, practical homes. It's like they invented the original sustainable architecture, except they didn't need a fancy degree to figure it out. But those buffalo hides weren't just convenient building materials. They were actually perfect for dealing with the plains' wild weather patterns. When it rained, the hides would tighten up and become even more waterproof. When it was hot, they could be adjusted to let in a breeze. Speaking of weather, you wouldn't believe how these tippies handled the crazy temperature swings and storms that the plains could dish out. If you've never experienced life on the Great Plains, you're missing out on what might be nature's most dramatic mood swings. One minute you're sweating like you're in a sauna, and the next you're reaching for your thickest blanket. On a typical summer day, temperatures can swing from a scorching 100 degrees Fahrenheit down to a chilly 50 degrees Fahrenheit once the sun sets. My aunt from Florida visited Nebraska once and packed only shorts and t-shirts. Boy, did she regret that decision when nighttime rolled around. These crazy temperature changes would have made wooden houses a real headache for plains tribes. You know how your house feels like an oven in summer, even with air conditioning? Now, take away the AC, the insulation, and add some gaps between those wooden logs. You'd basically be living in an oversized toaster oven during the day and a refrigerator at night. Not exactly what you'd call comfortable living. But here's where teepees really showed their genius design. Those buffalo hide walls weren't just tough, they were smart. When the summer heat was beating down, people could simply roll up the bottom edges of their teepee. This created a natural breeze that would flow through the dwelling, kind of like opening all the windows in your house, except better because you could adjust exactly how much airflow you wanted. Too much wind? Just lower one side. Too hot? Lift another. It was like having a prehistoric thermostat. The winter setup was equally clever. Those same hide walls could be lowered all the way to the ground and packed with extra insulation around the base. Some tribes would even add an extra layer of buffalo hides during the coldest months. Historical records show that even when temperatures dropped to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, people inside teepees stayed surprisingly cozy. Archaeological evidence suggests that plains tribes developed specific seasonal modifications for their teepees. Winter teepees often had a slightly different angle to their poles, creating a steeper pitch that helped shed snow more effectively. But the real magic of teepee design showed up during those famous plains storms. Anyone who's lived in Tornado Alley knows the wind out there isn't playing around. We're talking about gusts strong enough to flip cars and tear roofs off buildings. Yet teepees stood their ground like champions. Their cone shape was basically nature's version of aerodynamic engineering. Instead of fighting against the wind like a stubborn wooden wall, teepees let the wind slide right around them. It's the same principle modern skyscrapers use, except plains tribes figured it out centuries ago. Studies of traditional teepee designs have shown they could withstand winds of up to 70 miles per hour without breaking a sweat. Meanwhile, modern building codes often only require houses to handle winds of about 90 miles per hour, and that's with all our fancy modern materials and engineering. Not bad for a primitive dwelling, right? The smoke flap system at the top of teepees was another stroke of genius. Those adjustable flaps didn't just let smoke out, they worked as a sophisticated ventilation system. By adjusting the flaps based on wind direction, families could control the airflow inside their home with remarkable precision. It's like having a smart home system, except it was powered by common sense instead of electricity. Recent wind tunnel tests on traditional teepee designs have shown that these smoke flaps created a low-pressure zone above the teepee, actually helping to draw smoke up and out, a principle we still use in modern ventilation systems. Speaking of rain, teepees had that covered too. The outer layer of buffalo hide would naturally tighten when wet, creating an almost waterproof seal. Any drips that did make it through would run down the sloped walls instead of pooling on top like they would on a flat roof. Meanwhile, folks living in wooden houses were probably keeping buckets handy to catch all the leaks, assuming they could find enough wood to build a house in the first place, which brings us back to our previous point about the scarcity of trees on the plains. All this climate control came without a monthly utility bill or a complicated HVAC system. Who needs a smart thermostat when you've got a home that practically adjusts itself? Though I bet some people today wouldn't mind trading their mortgage payments for a few buffalo hides. Historical records from early European explorers often expressed amazement at how comfortable teepees remained during extreme weather. One account from 1851 describes a group of travelers seeking shelter in a Sioux teepee during a massive thunderstorm. They were shocked to find it dry and warm inside, while their own canvas tents had been rendered useless by the rain. These weren't just survival shelters. They were sophisticated dwellings that had been perfected over generations of trial and error. Modern architects have actually started studying teepee design principles for inspiration in creating more sustainable buildings. The natural ventilation systems, passive solar heating, and efficient use of materials are all concepts that align perfectly with current green building practices. It turns out our ancestors might have known a thing or two about environmental engineering after all. Speaking of comfort, you might be surprised to learn just how cozy these mobile homes really were. First off, let's address the elephant in the room: sleeping arrangements. Modern folks often assume that sleeping on the ground must have been awful, but that shows how little they know about teepee life. Plains tribes created sophisticated bedding systems using buffalo robes and soft grasses. These natural mattresses were actually pretty similar to modern memory foam. They molded to your body shape and provided excellent support. Archaeological studies have found that plains peoples had fewer back problems than their contemporaries who lived in wooden structures. Take that, expensive mattress companies. The interior space of a teepee was a marvel of efficient design. A typical family teepee measured about 16 feet in diameter and 15 feet high. That's roughly 200 square feet of living space, about the size of a modern studio apartment. But unlike your cramped studio where you're constantly bumping into furniture, teepee space was used brilliantly. Everything had its place along the walls, leaving the central area open for daily activities. It's like those tiny house shows on TV, except plains tribes figured out space efficiency centuries before it became trendy. Here's something that might surprise you. Teepees had better air quality than most modern homes. No joke. The central fire pit, combined with the smoke flaps, created a natural air circulation system that would make today's HVAC engineers jealous. Smoke didn't just go straight up and out. It created a convection current that pulled fresh air in through the bottom of the teepee. This constant air exchange meant less dust, fewer allergens, and none of that stuffy feeling you get in sealed-up houses. A study in the 1960s actually found that the air exchange rate in a properly set-up teepee was better than most modern homes with central air. Temperature control wasn't just about survival, it was about comfort. The buffalo hide walls were amazing insulators. When properly tanned, these hides created a membrane that was both breathable and weather-resistant. During winter, the airspace between the inner liner and outer cover acted like double-pane windows, trapping a layer of insulating air. In summer, this same design kept the interior cool. Modern tests have shown that a well-made teepee can maintain a temperature difference of up to 25 degrees Fahrenheit between inside and outside without any mechanical heating or cooling. But the most impressive thing was in the details. Take the teepee liner, for instance. This wasn't just decoration, it was a sophisticated piece of engineering. The liner prevented rain from dripping down the poles, stopped drafts, and created that insulating air pocket we talked about. It also acted as a reflective surface for the central fire, directing heat back into the living space instead of letting it escape through the walls. My heating bill would probably give me less heart attacks if my house was this efficient. And let's talk about bugs, or rather, the lack of them. While log cabins were basically five-star hotels for every creepy crawly in the area, those gaps between logs might as well have been bug highways. Teepees were surprisingly insect-resistant. The smoke from the central fire acted as a natural insect repellent, and the tight-fitting hide walls didn't leave convenient entry points. Plus, unlike wooden structures, buffalo hides didn't attract wood-boring insects. No termite inspections needed. The acoustics inside a teepee were something special too. The cone shape and soft walls created a natural amphitheater effect that made conversation easy while dampening outside noise. It's like having a built-in sound system designed by nature. Some elders who grew up in teepees have mentioned that you could whisper from one side to the other and be heard clearly. Try doing that in your echo chamber of a living room. The average teepee could be heated to a comfortable temperature with just 1/10 of the firewood needed for a log cabin of similar size. That's some serious energy efficiency right there. And speaking of efficiency, maintaining a teepee was way easier than dealing with a wooden house. No rotting boards to replace, no leaky roof to patch, no paint to refresh. Just regular smoke treating of the hides kept them in good condition for years. But while teepees excelled at providing physical comfort, their true brilliance went far beyond just being a cozy place to sleep. Ask any real estate agent today about what makes a perfect home, and they'll probably start rattling off buzzwords like open concept and great flow. Well, Plains tribes had that figured out long before HGTV was even a thing. Their teepees weren't just shelters, they were perfectly designed social spaces that brought families and communities together. The round shape of a teepee might seem like a simple design choice, but it was actually a stroke of social genius. Everyone sat in a circle facing each other. No corners to hide in, no separate rooms to retreat to, just open space that encouraged conversation and connection. It's funny how modern offices are now spending millions to create collaborative spaces that basically copy what Plains tribes did centuries ago. Maybe they should have saved their money and just bought some buffalo hides. Archaeological evidence shows that the average family teepee was about 16 to 18 feet in diameter. That might not sound huge, but the circular layout made incredibly efficient use of space. Studies of traditional living patterns show that a family of 6 could live comfortably in this space. Try fitting that many people in a modern tiny house without starting a family feud. The layout was so efficient that anthropologists have found that Plains families typically spent more time in direct interaction with each other than their European counterparts who lived in rectangular homes. The central fireplace wasn't just for cooking and warmth, it was the heart of family life. Unlike European-style houses where fireplaces were stuck against a wall, the teepee's central fire created a natural gathering spot. Everyone could see each other's faces in the firelight, making storytelling and conversation much more personal. Traditional stories tell us that this arrangement was specifically designed to strengthen family bonds. One elder's account from the 1800s described how children would learn their tribe's history and values just by listening to the adults talk around the fire each evening. The entrance of every teepee traditionally faced east, toward the rising sun. This wasn't just for practical reasons like catching the morning light. It created a standard layout that made every teepee in the camp instantly familiar. You could visit any family's teepee and know exactly where everything would be. The sleeping areas were always arranged in the same pattern, with parents on one side and children on the other. It was like having an unwritten floor plan that everyone understood. The social benefits extended beyond just family life. When tribes gathered for ceremonies or celebrations, teepees could be arranged in circles to create larger community spaces. The largest recorded teepee circles from archaeological sites show evidence of hundreds of teepees arranged in perfect rings. One famous site in Alberta, Canada, shows the remains of a teepee ring that housed over 400 families. That's more people than you'd find in many modern apartment complexes. But perhaps the most clever social aspect of teepee living was how it handled privacy. Despite being one open space, Plains tribes developed sophisticated systems for creating private areas when needed. Simple hide screens could temporarily divide spaces, and the arrangement of belongings along the walls created natural boundaries. It was like having adjustable room dividers, except nobody had to pay for expensive sliding doors or room partitions. The teepee's design also made it perfect for expanding families. When a young couple got married, they didn't have to save up for years to buy their own home. They just needed enough buffalo hides to make their own teepee. And these new homes could be set up right next to their parents' teepees, creating extended family groups that helped raise children and take care of elders. No need for expensive retirement homes or daycare centers. The social nature of teepee living even influenced how people stored their belongings. Everything had its place along the walls, but nothing was truly hidden away in closed containers or locked boxes. This open storage system meant that sharing was natural and easy. Need to borrow something? You could see exactly where it was. This physical transparency promoted a culture of sharing and community support that many modern societies are trying to recreate through sharing economy apps and community programs. One particularly clever aspect was how teepees could be combined for larger gatherings. By simply rearranging the poles and joining the covers, two or more teepees could be connected to create larger spaces for ceremonies or big family gatherings. It was like having a modular community center that could be assembled whenever needed. No booking fees or rental contracts required. These incredible dwellings weren't just homes. They were the perfect balance of private space and community connection. In fact, modern architects studying teepee design have been stunned by just how many social innovations were built into these simple structures.